Okay, so I thought I would make a video on sewing face masks. This is going to be geared for somebody who has very little sewing experience. If you already know how to sew, you might just want to go to the website, take a look at that tutorial, and sew away. But if you don't have any experience and you think that this might be a really good time to learn a new hobby, then this would be hopefully a good video to watch. Okay, so I went to craftpassion.com and found a pattern, face mask pattern version 2. This is the one that's being used, I think, pretty widely. And when you print it off, you want to download the PDF. Don't print it from your browser window or it won't print to scale. And after you download and print it, make sure that you take your ruler and you measure this 2 inches and that it is exactly 2 inches. Otherwise, when you go to cut it out, it won't be the right size. I like to I printed off 4 actually, and I printed 1 that I could write my notes on, and then 1 that I keep as a master pattern in case I accidentally cut into or wreck my working patterns. And then I made 1 for the men's size and 1 for the ladies' size. Yeah, this is ladies, this is the men's. All right, so besides the pattern, you're also going to need some cotton. I'm using something that's printed and then like a solid muslin. I happen to have a fabric stash and already had these things here at home. That's super important for you to pre-wash your fabrics. If you don't pre-wash them and you're using 2 different fabrics, then what's going to happen, and even if you have the same fabrics, they could shrink up differently, and then, or it'll shrink on a hole and it'll get kind of wonky. So you just want to make sure that you wash and dry them first. And then after they're washed and dried, then you start doing your, you cut them out and sew them. So I have printed and then a solid color, and I've got a couple of different versions here. I've been just sort of cutting out of my stash from over there. All right, the other thing that you're gonna need are some sewing pins and some scissors. I like to use a cutting mat and a rotary cutter and quilting ruler when I cut things out, but if you don't have those things, you can just use scissors too, that's fine. Okay, we're going to start with our outer fabric, which is the printed fabric, and you're going to fold it so that the right sides are together. Something that's really important when you cut any pattern is to make sure that the grain of your fabric is going up and down. And, you can kind of see, like threads, when they're woven together, they're vertical or horizontal, and you just want to make sure you always lay your pattern piece so that you're lining up with those vertical and horizontal lines. You don't want to do it crooked like this, because then what happens is it sort of stretches out of shape. And if you've ever had a shirt that like one of the arms wants to twist, or you have a skirt that's always twisting around in a really weird and funky way, a lot of times it's because one of the pieces of fabric was cut off grain, a little bit crooked. And so if you want everything to lay nicely, you just always want to make sure that you're cutting with a grain. And generally speaking, commercial patterns are printed and they'll tell that, in the pattern, they'll show with an arrow where to cut. So we're going to go ahead and line this up this way. Now this pattern does not have any seam allowances printed into it. That means that when you lay your pattern on your fabric, you have to cut extra to the outside. This is made with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So on the outer fabric, what we're going to do is cut a 1/4 inch wider on these 3 sides. And then on this ear side, for the main fabric, you actually need a 1 inch seam allowance. So you're going to cut 1 inch away from this line. That's where the quilting ruler really helps, because you can line up and get a really nice even 1 inch. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this and cut it out at a 1/4 inch. I need both hands, so I'm going to pause my video here. Okay, real quick, I wanted to show how I put my pins in, because when you are pinning a pattern to fabric, you want to make sure that everything stays really nice and flat. You don't want to like lift it up and pinch it and end up having it be, kind of crooked underneath of there, because then when you cut it, it's crooked. So what I like to do is sort of rock my needle down. I'm going to try to do this one-handed, but I kind of rock and push my needle down, and then, I kind of rock and push it down, and then I'll push it sort of using 2 hands, kind of push it this way, but I try to keep it. This is really hard to do and hold the phone at the same time. Okay, but anyway, I try to keep it as flat as possible. That's the point. When you put your pins in, make sure that you're keeping everything as flat as possible, because if your fabric is wrinkling up underneath of your paper pattern, then those wrinkles are going to distort the shape, and you want the shape to be as accurate as possible. Okay, so this is where the quilting ruler comes in handy. What you do is you line up here at the 1 inch mark. I'm just going to line it up carefully, and then I can go ahead and use my rotary cutter to just zip along here, and I'll have a perfect 1 inch seam allowance on this straight side. Okay, so now you can see I have a 1/4 inch cut along these 3 edges and my 1 inch seam allowance on this side. I'm gonna pop my pins out. Whoops. I'm going to lift it off my pattern piece, but I actually left this right on the table how it was because it's perfectly lined up, and our first seam is going to be along this curve. So we're going to put in, I like 4 pins along this edge. I like to put my pins in perpendicular. Let's see if I can show you how I do this. Balance my phone here. So when I put in my pins, again, you want to try not to distort your fabric. You want things to lay as flat as possible in order to get really nice seams. So I like to take my 2 fingers of my left hand and sort of hold down here. And then when I put my pin in with my right hand, I kind of scoop and kind of just push up there. But, you know, while kind of holding it down. There. It just keeps it nice and flat. There, just kind of scoop and push up. There. Okay, and I'm going to do that for four pins. Okay, so this side is pinned together. Now I'm going to repeat, and I'm going to do the same thing with the same piece of pattern on my lining fabric. But this time, when you do your lining fabric, you actually don't need to put the 1 inch on this side. You only do a 1/4 inch all the way around. So I'm going to do that now. Okay, so now I have my lining fabric cut out with a 1/4 inch extended for my seam allowance, and I'm going to pin along the top the same way I did with the outer fabric. Okay, we're ready to sew, so I'm going over to the sewing machine. This is from Walmart, and it is a magnetic, there's a magnet underneath of here, pin catch, and I love it because first of all, when you accidentally spill pins on the floor, it's really easy to just wave it over the top and pick them up. But the other thing is that when you're sewing and you want to pull a pin out, you can just kind of generally throw it towards this, and it snaps it down, and it just means that you're stepping on less pins, which is always a good thing. When I'm sewing, a lot of times I keep it right here just because it's I've got kind of a nice big throat on my sewing machine, and if I'm sewing little things, then it's really easy because it's easy for me to take them out as I go. One thing I didn't mention earlier, I've got a big stack of these cut out from before, is that one of the reasons that I like to pin perpendicularly instead of along with the seam edge, I think, you know, it's maybe a personal preference, but when I'm sewing, it's easier to pull the pin out as I go. I'm not sort of pulling from this direction, but when I get really close to the needle, I can pull it out this way. This is how you pin down appliques most often, with really tiny pins. And so once I started doing a lot of applique work, I just started pinning all of my things together this way, and I feel like it's pretty convenient. The only time you wouldn't want to do this is if you're working with a fabric that is really sensitive to the holes, because like a pin does put a tiny hole in the fabric. So if you're working with like a silk or a chiffon or something like that would pull, then you would only want to put your pins in this outside seam allowance. But because this is cotton, and cotton is really durable, you don't really have to worry about it. But so anyway, I like to pin perpendicularly. All right, so we're gonna make our first seam along this front curve, and I like to start on this. I'm gonna show you why. So we've got 2 edges, right? We could start here, or we could start here. If we start here, you've got this little point, and something that happens a lot, especially when you're first starting to sew, is that for whatever reason, well, not for whatever reason, if you're not holding these tails taut enough, and let's see if I can get this up high enough, there's like a slit basically that your needle goes down into in your machine, this little opening, and it collects off of the hook, the bobbin thread. And so if you're not holding these nice and taut, and your fabric is too close to the edge of that, it sort of gobbles it up, and then all of a sudden your fabric is sort of stuck, and you're untangling it out of the inside of your machine. It's really frustrating. And so because this is this kind of skinny little point, that's more likely to happen on this side. But you look at like this is a thicker, doesn't have that little point, so it's going to be less likely to happen on this side. So this is just a little tip for when you're trying to decide which end to start on. That's what I'll usually look at, is what's going to most likely get eaten by the sewing machine. Another thing that's super, super important when you sew, and this is something that gets overlooked, is using the correct needle size. So when you buy your packages of needles, let me see if I have, yeah, okay. First of all, you want to change them often. Do not be shy at all about changing your needles often. You also want to make sure you buy the right kind. I sew with a lot of stretch fabric, which requires a ballpoint needle. Cottons don't. They require a standard needle, like a universal needle, and you want to use the right size. So like on the back of the package, it'll show you according to the fabric you're using. If you're using a needle that's too big or too small, that's when you have a lot of tension problems, and sometimes the fabric will tend to get more tangled up underneath. That's always the first thing to check, that you have a fresh, sharp needle and that it is the right size if you're start sewing and you're having problems. I check there, and the other thing is I will rethread my machine, and then I will also make sure I clean it out really well, because what happens is as you sew, there's a lot of dust and it gets caught up underneath and inside. So anyway, little just tips and tricks if you're fairly new to sewing. All right, so I'm gonna line my fabric up. Now, when I put this foot down, I'm actually not gonna try to line it up so the needle's gonna hit right on this edge, because again, then it might be a little more likely to pull the fabric down into that slot and tangle it up. This cotton is pretty lightweight. If you have a thicker fabric, that doesn't happen as often, but when you're working with something that's a little on the lighter side, that's more likely to happen. Silks, chiffons especially wanna just get kind of sucked down in there. So I'm actually gonna, when I push my fabric back here, I'm gonna push it back a little past where that slot is. The other thing is that you're gonna wanna look at where your 1/4 inch mark is. I'm using a 1/4 inch foot. So if I line my fabric up right with the edge of my foot, then I'm gonna be exactly at a 1/4 inch when the needle is centered. But if you have a wider foot, then you're just gonna wanna look on your machine. Like, see, here's my 3/8 mark. This is my 1/4 inch mark. This is my 1/8 mark. So just make sure that you are looking at your machine at whatever says a 1/4 inch and line it up well. Put your pressure foot down. Oops. Okay, I have to select my stitch here. We're going to use just a regular standard straight stitch, whatever your standard straight stitch is on your machine. If you have a manual and you have to, mine automatically sets my length. If yours does not, then you're going to want to use, well, I think I've got like 2.4 here is the length of my stitch. That's how it's 2.4 millimeters between each stitch. That's how much fabric is moved through these, what are called the feed dogs. Okay, so, but if you have an electronic machine, you just hit straight stitch, it'll kind of do that for you. All right, so, but if you don't, like 2.5, that's a good length to use with cotton. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and put my pressure foot down. And when you start sewing, you want to make sure that in your fingers, you are pinching both the needle and the bobbin threads nice and tight. And then you're going to start, I'm going to do this no-handed. I don't recommend that, but I'm holding one hand with a phone camera. So I'm going to do no-handed. We'll see how that works. And I'm just gonna go really slow. And you wanna put just a little pressure back here to make sure you get past that little initial point. And then after that, don't put any pressure anywhere. A lot of times when people are first starting to sew, they're sort of yanking. They're kind of pulling the front and the back of the fabric. You don't wanna do that because you're gonna get wonky seams. You want to allow the sewing machine to feed that fabric in really evenly, and the best way to do that is to not add any pressure. So I only use one hand to steer, usually. I use one hand to steer, and you just want to go nice and slow. We're just going to keep, like for me, I'm going to keep this edge lined up here so that I know that I'm a 1/4 inch in, and I'm going to very gently just kind of move and steer. But if you notice, my hand is really lightly on here. Try to take your pins out. Try not to run over them. If you run over them, you can bend your needles. If you do accidentally run over it, it's okay, but it's better not to if you can help it. Also, I have really knocked a sewing machine out of timing by hitting a pin too fast, and then you have to take it in to be serviced, and that's not good. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to just finish up this seam. And again, I'm just kind of, just steering with my hand. I think it helps to be, I think it helps to have your hand to the side rather than pulling from the front and the back, because that's when you tend to pull more. Just something that when people are new to sewing, you tend to feel like you got to grip it really hard, and you really don't. Okay, I'm going to take this out, and there we go. Now, something I am not doing is back stitching at the start and the stop, because this seam is going to get crossed by other seams, so we don't have to do that. Sometimes when you're sewing, you need to lock your stitch in place, but for this particular seam on this front edge, we don't have to. All right, so I'm going to lift up my pressure foot. I have a button. You might have a lever in the back. And then if you have some, I have some thread clippers right here. Just gonna clip those nice and close. All right, so now we have our first seam, you can see along this front edge, and I'm gonna go ahead and do that with the patterned front fabric. Okay, so we have this first seam. Anytime you're sewing on a curve, you have to clip the curve. Otherwise, the fabric gets bunched up and it doesn't lay correctly. So what that means is on this this is called your seam allowance, because it's what's to the outside of the seam. You're going to take your scissors and you're going to clip, not all the way to this thread, because otherwise you'll put a hole in it, but maybe there's only 1/4 inch, so I would go maybe about halfway, and you can do that every inch or about every inch. I like to use these little embroidery scissors because it just helps. And see, I'm going to go like this, and then I'm going to go another inch. I'm just being careful and slow, because if you cut across this thread, then this is essentially garbage and you have to start over. So don't be quick about it. Just take your time. Probably don't do it one-handed, because that's probably not a great idea. But I wish I could put my phone on my forehead. I think that would make this a little easier. Anyway, okay, so there we go. Both are clipped. And then the next part is that we're going to turn these right side out, right? So that you see your pattern, and we're going to fold this seam to the right. You could use an iron and press it down this way. I don't think it's necessary. We're just going to go nice and slow. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to stitch from the right side. While we hold this seam allowance to the right, we're actually going to stitch down about maybe 1/16 of an inch from our original seam. And it's going to be a top stitch. So you're going to see that seam, but it's going to hold this salvaged, this seam allowance edge here to the side. And that's important. Okay, so let me see if I can balance here. Get this under. Hang on. Okay, so this is a part where you're probably going to want to use 2 hands. And what you're going to want to do is kind of spread this out, so that it's laying nice and flat, so that you're opening your seam out fully. But also under this finger, you should feel that seam allowance that's being pushed to the right side. So it'll be like a little lump. You want to make sure it doesn't twist under there. Go really slow on this part so that you get a nice close seam. And I'm just lining this up just to the right. This slit is where the needle is going to, enter the fabric. And so I'm going to line my seam up just to the left of that, so that my new top stitch seam goes it'll fall right about there. Okay. So I'm going to go super slow. I'm going to kind of pull a little. This is where we want to pull, not forward and backward, but where we kind of want to pull it open. And again, you want to feel and make sure that that extra, that allowance from the back is there. All right, and as we come along the curve, if you try to keep it flat, it's going to wrinkle. You can't. So you almost have to you see how it wants to cup up? So you have to allow that to happen and just go nice and slow. There we go. I'm kind of holding it, and I'm feeling and making sure that edge is going, that it's going to the right. Right? Okay, and so then what we have, again, you don't have to back stitch here either. Whoops, there we go. Oh, and I ran out of bobbin thread. But what you can see now is that you have this little bit of top stitching. And what it does is it holds this extra edge to the right. And you're going to do that for both the front piece, and then the same for this lining piece as well. You're going to do the same thing, and you're going to put them both towards the right. And you'll see why they both go towards the right in a minute, but same thing. So when you pull it under your machine, you're going to, hold it this way, hold it open, push it to the right. Okay, so this is what you should have now. You should have two pieces, a liner fabric and an outer fabric, and you'll have this nice, you can see that it's developing this really nice kind of cup shape that's going to fit over somebody's nose, and you'll have your top stitching done, right? You can kind of see that little thread there. It just finishes it really nicely and makes sure that that seam goes to the stays. It doesn't, like if you didn't top stitch it down, you could get away with not top stitching it down. Sorry, I'm fumbling my words. If you didn't top stitch it down and you put it together, then that seam allowance can move back and forth in there. And remember, that's running right across the middle of your face, and that might be a little uncomfortable. So by taking that extra step to stitch it down to one side, you're going to keep that always pointing in the same direction, and then we're going to nest the two seams together, and it'll be more comfortable, and it'll just have a better shape. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is sew the lining into the outer fabric, and we're going to do that by sewing along the top edge and the bottom edge. So we need to pin them together, and we're going to right sides together. And I'm going to put my lining fabric on the bottom here, and then I'm going to take my outer fabric on the bottom layer facing up, and then I'm going to take my lining fabric with the seam allowance facing towards me, right? So the two right sides are together. And now because we pushed these both to the right when we were sewing them, now they're actually, when they face each other, they're opposite of each other. And that's really nice because now when you sort of take your thumb and push them together, you want them to nest into each other so that the centers are hitting exactly. And because one seam, see how this one goes this way and then this one goes this way, it reduces the bulk of that seam, and it just gives us a really nice spot. You can line that center up real well. You can kind of feel when it locks in together by kind of wiggling back and forth. And then what we're going to do is pin. All right, let me see if I can balance this. Okay, so I've got my phone kind of balanced, and now I can use both hands. All right, so we're going to lock this in, and then I'm just going to take, I like to start in the center because this is where it's important for it to line up, and I'm going to take and pull a pin along that center, and then I like to pin maybe every inch just to, we're just going to line up the edges of your, these two fabrics together, and pin. Again, I like to pin perpendicularly. And what I want to make sure I do, like I want to line them up well, but I don't want to stretch them. See how you could stretch it and then it's all out of shape? It's not going to sit in the right spot. So you want to like kind of pull them together, but do it gently. Don't pull and tug, because otherwise you're pulling and tugging it out of shape. And then it's going to come together a little wonky. There, we're going to do another pin here. And a pin at this end. All right, now I'm going to go to the other side, starting at the center again. I'm just going to kind of, like rather than, I kind of just rub back and forth and kind of line it up that way without tugging and pulling. Okay, and then let's just keep going here. And see how it's falling together really nicely. And yeah, there we go. And I'm going to throw a pin in here. All right, now, there we go. Now we want to flip it to this other side. We're going to do the same thing. So, I've got these little tails. We want to make sure we always clip those off. Makes your sewing nice and neat. Actually, let me clip here too. I've got a little thread tail here to clip. Okay. All right, and nest these again so that it lines up nice and tight. And you can kind of feel how it lines up really well along the center seam. Yep. And put a pin in the center, and I'm going to do the same thing. Go out, and because there's a curve on this side, so it's not difficult to line up, but this almost sort of lines itself up, whereas this one you have to kind of move the fabric around a little bit to hit the two edges together. But once you've done that on this side just sort of lines itself up. Makes it nice and easy. And I'm going to put a pin here. All right, and then we're going to start again. Center out. And we'll pin, pin, and pin. There we go. Okay, here we go. We're going to stitch 1/4 inch in on this long edge. Make sure you hold your tails. I'm doing this one-handed. It's a little wonky, but that's okay. Take your pin out. Try not to run over it. And this is where if you use a lot of pins, you can be a little more, like you know that everything's where it's supposed to be. If you don't use very many pins, then you might be still arranging fabric while you're sewing it, and then your seams aren't going to be quite as nice. Now, when you get to this edge, this center seam, you can see there's an angle here. So go ahead and you can use your crank, or I have a button to put my needle down. Put your needle down in your fabric, lift your presser foot. You might have a lever behind, and then and reposition it, because see this, it angles. It's not a straight edge exactly. It angles so that it tucks under the chin. It forms a really nice cup on your face. And then we just keep going. Oh, you see I ran over that pin, but that's okay. Okay. Okay, we'll take it out. And then we're going to do the same thing on this other long edge where we seam 1/4 inch in. Oops, let's hold our tails down. Okay, and when you're going around the corner, just go nice and slow. Again, don't tug. I mean, you can see I'm barely holding the fabric. Just steer. When you come around this edge, you gotta kind of lift it because you got this sort of cupping shape, right? And you might have to go kind of slow because you want this to be a nice corner. And kind of rotate it around. That's where I'll run over a pin, is on a corner like that. And I just go slow so I don't damage my needle. But don't break your machine, so be careful. Okay. And we're going to go like this. Take that pin out. There we go. And just come right off the edge there. There we go. Okay, so after you go through and clip all your little thread tails, oops, there we go. Now we're going to turn it right side out. So you're basically going to just like if you were turning a sleeve right side out. Okay, and then what we want to do is make sure that we sort of push that seam out so that nothing's tucked in, right? And we're going to top stitch along just a teeny little 1/8 of an inch or even 1/16 of an inch, just like we top stitched this center. We're going to top stitch this to hold everything in place really nicely. You could, if you skip this step, it's not going to cup around the face as well. This is just a nice way to keep everything in place. And I'm kind of wiggling it back and forth between my fingers here in order to, flatten it out. You could use an iron and press it, but you don't really need to. Okay, and then the thing that I like to do is flip it over. Now, see how we have this hanging out? When we top stitch, we want to top stitch this down too by the 1/4 inch so that we don't have a raw edge. And I like to take and put a pin there. So I'm going to pin. This is the one space where I don't pin perpendicularly. See, I'm going to pin it like this so that when I put it under the machine, it holds it down nice and flat. So I'm going to pin there. I'm going to do that on each of the 4 corners. Okay, so now if you're having trouble, like mine wants to kind of puff out here weird. If you're having trouble and it's wanting to do that, then you just kind of like wiggle it back and forth until you get it nice and flat. Remember, those seams kind of nest against each other. And if you want to, you can throw a pin in. Again, this is going to go with the seam allowance because because you want to kind of hold it along that. And probably the right way to do this is to go use an iron. I just don't feel like walking all the way up the stairs, so I'm going to pin it instead. But if you want it to be really nice and neat, go iron it flat. Okay, I actually just moved my pin to the other side. I like to top stitch so that I can see the top fabric. And what we're going to do is come here and we're going to go, do you see how close to the edge it is? It's like a 1/16 of an inch from edge. And you're just going to run a seam all the way along both the top and bottom edge. Okay, so now we have this nice, neat seam right along the edge that just sort of holds everything in place, and it helps for this to cup over. You can see this is forming a really nice shape. All right, then we're going to flip it. We're almost done. We're going to flip it here. Again, you can use an iron. I'm not going to. And we're going to fold this so that this edge meets this edge, right, in half. So about a 1/4 inch. And then just use your fingers to, it's called finger press it down. Sort of just kind of push with some pressure to crease it. And then we're going to fold it again. There we go. Okay. And finger press it down. If you use an iron in this part, it'll stay down nice and tight for you. I recommend that if you're just starting out. All right, and then, okay, so if you ironed it now, it would stay nice and flat. Okay, but if you're gonna cheat like me and not iron it, we wanna think about how we're gonna put it in the machine. So it's gonna go in the machine, the needle's gonna come down this side, this is gonna go, yeah. So what we want to do is put our pins in, and again, this is where I'm not going to pin perpendicular because I want it to catch more. So I'm going to pop a pin in this way, and then I'm going to do the same thing on this. We're going to fold, meet the edges, finger press, fold again, right, and finger press it down. And this is what creates that little tube that your elastic goes through. Okay, and then we're going to pin this in. Use 1 pin, 2 pins, whatever you feel comfortable with. I'm going to just do 1 pin, but you can use 2 pins if you want. And then we're going to put it on the machine, and we're going to stitch really close to this edge. Now, you want to make sure you catch it, so don't go right on the edge because then it might come apart, but maybe like an 1/8 in, because then this space is what's going to be left for where your elastic is going to string in. Okay, here we go. We're just gonna put it down here. Oops, that's a little wonky, but that's okay. And this is all a little one-handed. Now, when we do this, because it's not gonna cross over, we wanna make sure we lock all of the other seams, something folded over it so we didn't have to lock in our stitches, but for this, we definitely do. So to lock in the stitch, what you wanna do is back stitch. You're gonna go backwards. So I'm gonna press this is my reverse button. Sometimes they're on the, like if you have knobs here, sometimes you lift a knob up to go reverse, but for this machine, it's electronic, so you press a button. So I'm gonna press my button, I'm gonna go backwards, like maybe 3 or 4 stitches, and then come back forward again. And that just locks it in place so that your stitching doesn't come apart. All right, you can do that for both sides. Okay, I've got 2 pieces of 1/4 inch elastic. That's what I have. Elastic is really hard to get a hold of right now. So whatever you can get your hands on is good. If it's an 1/8 inch elastic, then you're probably just gonna cut it, string it through here and knot it. But I have 1/4 inch elastic because that's all I could order. And so I'm gonna use a safety pin to pull this through the tube. And then afterwards, I'll stitch it closed. Okay, actually I lied. If you're going to use a safety pin, then you would safety pin the elastic to the edge, and then you kind of shove that safety pin through here. Now it's really near, it's really close, and it's kind of difficult to do. I happen to have this awesome tool for threading elastic. That's what I'm going to use. So I just pop my elastic through here, about halfway through, and then we're just gonna pop it through. Okay, so once your elastic is through, you're going to overlap the edges by about, maybe 1/4 inch, probably actually closer to 1/2 inch, and you're just going to stitch it down. I like to stitch in 2 different places, going across and across the middle, so that it looks like a letter I, because that makes sure it doesn't pull apart. Okay, so I'm going to start with the pin vertically, and I'm going to sew from here to here, and then I'm going to take the pin out, and I'm going to sew across and across to make a letter I. Okay, actually, I'm going to have you cut 9 inch or 10 inch pieces of elastic. I think when you use this thicker 1/4 inch elastic that it just is a little, it doesn't maybe stretch as much. So if you have 1/8 inch elastic, maybe I'd go with a little shorter. I think the pattern recommendation was between 6 and 8 inches. But once I put it on with this 1/4 inch elastic, it felt really tight because I think it's just a little bulkier. So I use 9 inch pieces and then stitch them together. My sewing machine does not love elastic, so it always looks a not that great. But anyway, I'm just going to slide that so it's hidden in here, and then it's done.